This is Lightning Power Lunch with Dave Mishkin and Greg Linnelli on Lightning Radio.
It sounds just simple and boring, but puck management's a big thing, and every time you go down the ice, you want to score, but a big part of it too is field position and how much you making the team work in the defensive zone, and I think that's been a big part of it for us is how we've managed the puck. We have especially early in the year, we turned it over and we're trying to manufacture offense out of nothing, and now we're just kind of letting the game come to us a little bit. There's the guys are working their tails off, and I think our forecheck's been a big part of it, but you start turning it into a 3/4 ice game, and it's you're not defending as much. It's worked out for it, but the puck management's been a big thing.
Puck management, yes, it has. John Cooper. It's a big deal. Coop leading off the show. Lightning hoping to take care of business tonight against Calgary. Can you hear an echo, partner? I can hear my echo going a little bit.
I'm out of practice in the studio. Steve just helped me. Yeah, you were coming through the studio and my computer.
Wow.
It was like
that just
Greg,
means it's authority.
Greg in stereo. You were coming through in stereo twice.
Man.
Steve's like, I can't take Mishkin anywhere.
Well, that's a factual
yes,
statement.
That is true.
But that's okay.
We'll need adjust. It's like Christopher Walken with the cowbells on SNL. We need more Greg. More Greg.
Wasn't
we
Will
need
Ferrell
Greg
part of that?
here, there, and everywhere.
Wasn't Will Ferrell part of that skit too?
Yes, he was.
Yes. That was pretty funny. Do you still watch Saturday Night Live?
No, I don't stay up that late anymore.
Did you used to watch it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been through different iterations. I mean, I remember the Joe Piscopo, Eddie Murphy SNL, which I'm probably showing
good.
my age here. Yeah.
Pretty good,
but
though.
Will Ferrell's pretty funny.
Yeah. Elf is your favorite movie, at least around Christmas time, correct?
Yes. So they were pretending, weren't they pretending in that Christopher Walken, Will Ferrell skit to be Blue Oyster Cult?
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. That's such
which I remember. I remember that. I remember that band.
Yeah.
Again, I'm showing my age.
No, they were good though. I remember that. Was that 70s, right?
Yeah. I was a wee lad, but I do remember Blue Oyster Cult.
I wasn't born yet. I'm not that old yet, but I'm going to get there. We've got a game tonight.
You missed the best decade in Pittsburgh sports history.
I did.
Although, I don't know. The Penguins weren't very good in the 70s.
Well,
but
the early, I
Pirates won 2 World Series, and the Steelers won all those Super Bowls. We're going way off tangent here. I just teed you up there. What's the best decade in Pittsburgh sports history?
Do I call it the 2010s? Is that how you would reference
Yeah.
Okay, so the 2010s. So the Pirates finally made a playoff series, and that was like the play-in game. That was a big deal. The Penguins win back-to-back cups.
Yes.
But I don't think the Steelers won a Super Bowl. They did it in the – remember the Penguins and the Steelers?
One of his early years. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, if you're gonna try and convince me that the Pittsburgh Pirates getting to the play-in game is comparable to 2 World Series that they won in the 70s.
Awful. But that's what I have to – I mean, look, it was either that or Sid Bream beating out Barry Bonds.
You agree the 70s was the best decade in Pittsburgh sports history,
because you could make the case
the
Pirates – Yeah, you could say the case the Pirates were the best team during that decade, although the Reds would have something to say about it, as you know, because you.
They may not have been the best team, but they won. They won one in the beginning of the decade, and they won one at the end of the decade.
Yeah,
I mean, they kind of bridged Clemente at the beginning, and he died tragically.
Yeah,
shortly thereafter. And that '79 team was like Dave Parker, Willie Stargell.
Yeah,
Kent Colvey. He was on those teams as well.
Teak. Yeah. And so,
anyway,
right. Just missed it. But Tad,
yes,
I've told you this. Thinking about the golden years, I've said what we are experiencing with the Tampa Bay Lightning, I think, is the greatest period of success in Tampa Bay Lightning history, or not Lightning history, Tampa Bay sports history. And maybe the history isn't as long for the Lightning, and then the Bucks. Obviously before. And the Rays. I mean, you understand there's newer teams compared to what we've seen before, but I have yet to have somebody disagree necessarily with that statement because of the run this team has been on.
I mean, the team has only been in existence for a little over 30 years, and if we're saying the last 10 is the golden age, I mean, that's a third of their existence. So the first 10 years were utterly unremarkable, except for some individual accomplishments and like the inaugural team, first playoff appearance. That happened in there, but they only made the playoffs once in the first 10 years. And then in the second decade, they made the playoffs more regularly, and they won a Stanley Cup.
Correct.
But this last decade, you want to go back to 2014, 2013, 14.
I think you have to.
Basically, I mean, I'm extending it a little bit here. But, made the playoffs every year but one.
Couple of cups,
made deep
it to
runs,
a couple finals. In addition to not winning the cup. I mean, I just think what is the hardest thing to do in sports? I think actually you can probably take the bigger picture in life is to maintain a consistent performance of excellence. It's hard to do.
Yeah.
There's some years things are just off. You're dealing with stuff. And
I think Lightning management deserves a lot of credit. So when the Lightning got good, let's just say with this current run, John Cooper's the head coach, they had to go off into the wilderness for a couple of years. And fortunately for them, it was only a couple of years. But they drafted and they developed really well. And they made some savvy free agent signings of guys who were not drafted, like Tyler Johnson. And those guys came up and had a huge impact on the Lightning. But eventually these players get older and they demand new contracts, which they have earned and deserve, and you can't keep everyone. So that's why windows start to close. The Lightning have been able to extend the window with some savvy deals where they have added younger players near the beginning of their career trajectory, not through the draft, because they haven't had the draft capital. I mean, Isaac Howard was a first-round pick, and he's going to be turning pro at some point here, maybe as soon as the end of this season.
Apparently everybody wants him up on this team.
Well, right. But I'm using him as an example, and he was a very, very late first-round pick.
Yeah.
Most of the other first-round picks the Lightning have had, if they've even had them, have been really, really late in the first round, with the exception of Cal Foote. And that was the one year they missed the playoffs by a point. They drafted middle of the first round. They took Cal Foote, and he's no longer with the organization. I mean, that's a separate story. But the Lightning just haven't had those top 10 picks, right? The guys that have been drafted in the top 10 that have found their way to the Lightning were not drafted by the Lightning. I mean, they traded for Sergachev. Now, granted, they traded a guy they took third overall back in 2013, Druin. They traded for Connor Geekie, who was an 11th overall pick. So if you're not going to have the players available through the draft, how are you going to do it? How are you going to push the window open or extend that window and keep things fresh with younger players? They've been very, very savvy in how they've done it, mostly through trades. But the trades they have made have been smart trades. They haven't been rental players for the most part. They got younger with the Sergachev trade. Geekie's younger than Sergachev. J.J. Moser is younger than Sergachev.
Yeah.
Now, Sergachev is a different player than J.J. Moser, but if we're just looking at how do you stay relevant and how do you keep your window open as your players age, well, you get good young players. How do you get good young players if you're not drafting high? The Lightning been able to do it.
It's interesting. The team they played
Excellent
tonight,
pro scouting. That's what it comes down to.
You're right. And player development. Because I think those go hand in hand. Those go hand in hand. And, I think you see a lot of teams. You mentioned the Pirates. They missed on a lot of draft picks, but the knock on them, too, was they had some talent, but they never developed them appropriately. Mm-hmm. The Lightning have found the sweet spot when it comes to getting the guy that maybe fits what you want, but then also allowing them to develop in a way that when they do finally get to the NHL level, most of the time, they contribute.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time. I mean, there's going to be several players. We've talked about this before. We saw him the other night, Mitchell Stevens. just didn't work out here. He found
He was
home.
a high second-round pick. If memory serves, the Lightning may have traded down to get him, so they had a first-round pick late, and then they moved down a couple of spots, and they took Mitchell Stevens.
He's with Seattle, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's right. So there have been some players like that, but look at Gonçalves. Maybe it took him a little bit to get his feet wet, but this second time around with the Lightning this season, he's looked like a better player. The back end's been a really good example of that. Radish and Perbix, coming up.
Yeah.
Now you have Crozier and Lilleberg, and while sometimes it might not be a draft pick per se, but you acquire them, you develop them in your system. There's something to be said for that. But
Chernak's another one.
Yeah.
I mean, Cernak was not a low pick. He was a second-round pick. He was not a first-round pick, though. He was not a top 15 pick. But that was an example of the Lightning moving on from an older player. Not old, but older, Ben Bishop.
Right.
And they got a prospect out of that deal.
And let's be clear.
Without using a draft pick, because they didn't have the draft picks.
That is correct. And, let's be clear, in hockey, very similar to baseball. Maybe it's because the age, I think that's what it is. In football, I feel like when you draft somebody in the college ranks, physically, I don't want to say emotionally, but certainly physically, the skill sets, it seems like, translate better to having more of an immediate impact on the team than it does in baseball.
Mm-hmm.
In hockey, because you're typically getting teenagers, and not that you're not getting teenagers at the college football level, but it feels like those guys are a little bit, maybe even a lot closer to contributing than
if they're
in those
playing
sports.
college football, they're not joining the NFL at age 18, which I don't even think you can do.
That is
right?
correct.
Don't you have to have X number of years?
You may be right. I need
All
to
right,
check
Steve's
on
saying 3. Yeah, you got to have 3 years of college football.
So at that
and
point,
look, I get that.
yeah, that's a physical sport, and
right.
you're playing with men. All the cliches, I think, add up. But let's face it. You mentioned he wasn't a top 15 pick, and I think you can say this for anybody. It really, once you get beyond, I think, your top 10 picks in both baseball and in hockey, it is a crapshoot. I mean, it is just
and some of it
science.
is how is the player going to develop.
Right.
So
That is
you talked about the development part of what the Lightning are doing, and Cernak had a full year in Syracuse before he ended up coming up the next year. And look, the Lightning have had second-round picks. So, like, the year that Eric Cernak was drafted in the second round, the Lightning could have taken Eric Cernak in the second round. All I'm saying is that in the absence of, like, transformational draft slots, let's say top 5 to top 10, the Lightning haven't had any of those. So
that is
if your core is going to get older, how do you keep your window open? And I'm kind of repeating myself here, but I think whether we look at, Brandon Hagel or J.J. Moser, I mean, these are just a couple of examples. Nick Paul is going to turn 30 this year. I mean, they've had him for a few years. They got him in a trade at age 27. That's how you do it. Look at the guys 100%. That were part of the Lightning's group when they got to the Stanley Cup final against Chicago. Let's just use that year as an example. Like Tyler Johnson's out of the league, right? Palat is still being a productive player, but he was going to move on because he was due a raise. He was at the end of a contract. Same with Killorn. Anton Strawman out of the league.
Tyler Johnson, is he in the league?
That's what I mentioned. Yeah, I mean, I think he had a brief stint with Boston. I think he may still be in their system.
Okay,
but I mean, that's just father time, right? It's just it happens to everybody. And of course, Stamkos is maybe the most prominent example where, again, the Lightning would have liked to have re-signed Steven Stamkos. It's just they couldn't come to an agreement on the dollars and the term. So, look back at that 2015 Cup run. Ryan Callahan, no longer in the NHL. He's retired. Phil Pula, no longer in the NHL.
Yeah, you're right.
So that team, if the Lightning haven't been able to kind of turn back the clock a little bit by getting some younger players since the 2015 Cup run, they would be looking at a closed window. That has not been the case. And they've also hit on some non-first-round picks, whether it's Cirelli or Point.
Cooch.
Just a couple of examples. Cooch, certainly. I think people felt that Cooch had, I don't know that they thought he would become one of the best players in the NHL, but there was a little hesitancy to draft him because there was uncertainty about would he leave Russia, because he hadn't at that point. But he did, and he came and played in the Quebec League after his draft year.
Second round pick. Point was second?
Third round.
Third round. Sorelli was second.
Sorelli I think was third round too.
Okay, so,
yeah.
I mean,
but you get into the third round.
I mean, that's
every team, unless they've traded away their first and second round picks, every team passed on those players at some point.
For Chicago?
Well, he wasn't drafted by Chicago. He was drafted by Buffalo.
What was his?
And they never signed him. So Chicago just signed him. I mean, he's more like in the Yanni Gourde department. I mean, Yanni was never drafted. Hagel was, but Buffalo didn't come to terms with him.
But think you're right about that, though. That core group initially that played Chicago in the finals, you need to transition away from that core eventually because they get older and you can't sign everybody. But look what the Lightning did to transition.
Yeah.
I mean, you not only just mentioned some good players, Dave, some Hall of Famers.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it's taken to keep that window open. Look at the team they're playing tonight. And this may be a good segue to talk about Calgary a little bit.
Yeah. And by the way, Jon Abbott, their TV voice, is going to be joining us shortly.
I don't know what the expectations were for Calgary over the last handful of years. You know that they were a team that had some really good players, but they had some things that have happened. Obviously, Johnny Gaudreau, rest in peace.
Yeah.
Is no longer there. Obviously, was with Columbus. You had the Huberdeau trade with Tkachuk that I think to this day just hasn't worked out, even though Huberdeau we think is a really good player. But based off of how things have transpired in Florida for Tkachuk, it's been, you could make the case, one-sided to a degree. And it's really been an organization, when you compare it to the Lightning, maybe that hasn't found a certain level of consistency, when it comes to consistently being a contender or one of the better teams in the West. Now, look, they're in a playoff position. They're not in a playoff spot. They're knocking on the door. But I don't know do we look at Calgary and say they're one of the best teams in the league or a favorite to win potentially the Stanley Cup? I look at the roster, and I'm kind of like, that's not a great-looking roster.
Well, so John will join us and give us more information on Calgary, but it has been a very difficult, that's the word I'll use, drop from that 2021-2022 season. When the Flames won their division, they had, let's be honest, it was the best line in hockey. Yep. It was Matthew Tkachuk, Johnny Gaudreau, and Elias Lindholm. They were as close to unstoppable that year, and it wasn't their only year together, but that was the year that they really led the Flames to a division title and cup aspirations. And they had to survive a very difficult first-round series against Dallas. Who knows if that affected them in the next round, but they lost to Edmonton. A bitter, bitter defeat. Arch rivals, they were favored. They were the higher seed, and they lost in 5. And then it wasn't long after that Johnny Gaudreau went to Columbus. Matthew Tkachuk demanded the trade, so they made that trade. Huberdeau and Weegar came from Florida. And the Flames have not made the playoffs since that year.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at their roster this year. Not even so much their roster. I'm looking at their numbers this year. They are in the mix. They could get into the playoffs this year. They actually just got bumped out of Wild Card 2 by Vancouver, which had a win last night. So they're right there. They could get in. Probably if they get in, it's going to be as a wild card. But they feel like a team that is not particularly outstanding in any one area and not particularly awful in any one area. So what do you make of that? It's kind of a vanilla team in terms of their stats. I'm not saying that their players are vanilla. I think that they feel they have a good young goalie in Wolf. I love Weegar. I think he is fantastic as an all-around player. I love his game. He can play the right. He actually likes to play the left as a righty. He can be offensive. He plays with a little bite to his game. Rasmus Andersson is a very solid defenseman. They have good players. Huberdeau is on a 6-game point streak. So, he's starting to score a little bit. But when you look at their stats, team stats, they do nothing exceptionally well, and they do nothing really exceptionally poorly either. In fact, their record might be a little bit better than their stats in that, they're several games above 500. But what does this mean long term? Like, if they get into the playoffs and they happen to get Winnipeg in the first round, as much as we acknowledge what Jack Michael said on the show earlier in the week, where he's like, is there any team that's gotten better, basically, that would have a stronger claim on winning the Stanley Cup? Maybe they get Vegas in the first round. But I don't see any way that if Calgary gets in, that they would be favored to win that first round series based on kind of how their team looks this year. And they may not get in. But if they don't get in, I think they're going to be in the mix. But what does that mean? Like, is it almost better to absorb the short-term pain of finishing near the bottom of the standings if it means that you can get one of those top 5 picks, or kind of eke your way into the playoffs, be overmatched potentially in a playoff series, and be a middle-of-the-pack team in terms of your draft position? That's what Calgary looks like to me right now. But they have improved on their standings position from last year. So that is something. I just don't know, like, what is the path completely out of the wilderness for this Calgary team? Because I don't see any more Johnny Gaudreaus coming down the pike for them, or Matthew Tkachuk's, for that matter. I mean, it doesn't seem like they have any of those players coming up through their system that you would hang your hat on, right? So they're in it right now. They're in a day-to-day situation where they're like, let's try and get into the playoffs. They're on a long road trip. They actually have kind of a stretch in their schedule similar to what the Lightning had in January, except that their players are fresh because they're coming off the break, right, for the Four Nations. But they have a 6-game road trip. They come home for 3, and then they come back east for 4 more.
Right.
So that's, 10 out of 13 on the road, and all 10 road games are in the East, I believe, if not all, most. That's a tough stretch. Let's see how they survive this, if they can survive it and stay in the race. But kind of big picture, what you call the 30,000-foot view, Greg, is this Calgary team an ascending team? Are they going to get into the position where they are like duking it out with the big boys in the West? Or is this just a marginal improvement over where they have been in the days when they were, like winning the division in 21-22? Like, they are so far removed from even a semblance of what that team looked like a few years ago. They are, but I mean, can they get back to that? Can they get back to that point?
Well, and this is where it comes back to level of excellence and why getting back a little bit to the Lightning, this has been so impressive because they've been able to almost bridge the gap of 2 different eras.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of planning, that takes a lot of scouting, takes a lot of developing, and it takes some luck.
Yeah.
Because you got to hope that when you do trade a player, you're getting a Hagel and a Paul back.
Right.
Or you're getting a Vasilevsky where they got him. Or Braden Point falls to you. Nikita Kucherov, people are a little concerned that he may not come over, and you say, you know what the heck, it's a second-round pick. It's worth it, and you just hit on more than you miss.
Yeah.
And it really becomes dynamic. in a lot of
Or,
ways.
I mean, you can miss. You can actually miss more than you hit as long as the ones you hit on are transformational players.
Yeah.
I mean, you do get, if you're having 1 pick per round, you get 7 picks every year.
Yeah.
Lightning have hit on some 7th-round picks. Andre Palat, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't need to hit on even the majority of them as long as the ones that you hit on turn into a Point or a Kucherov.
Oh.
I mean,
Dave, we say that, and you're right. But understand, we're talking about 2 Hall of Famers.
yeah.
At least the way their career is going. That and like impactful. I mean, super impactful on the same line. Then you factor in a Jake Gensel. Right. Then you get a guy like that, and you make that hard decision. Think about the teams that had to make a hard decision about their captain. Some don't make them. Some keep
Yeah.
their captain and icon. Lightning said, look, we want to keep you, I can't justify it, though. We're going to have to make the business decision to part ways. And what do? They essentially replace a Hall of Famer with, at least currently, one of the best forwards in the game offensively in Jake Gensel.
Well, let me just interject, because I think they would have liked to have had both Gensel and Stamkos.
Right.
But they couldn't have paid Stamkos what he got from Nashville, certainly, and presumably what he was asking for, and brought in Gensel, and done the other things that they wanted to do. So,
but that's
I mean, they added salary when they brought back Ryan McDonough.
They did.
How valuable, we were talking about this on the show yesterday, how valuable has Ryan McDonough been to this Lightning team this year?
These moves they've made have been huge, and they've turned out. Like they were risks. They were risks from alienating potentially your fan base when you move on from your iconic forward who's a Hall of Famer, and you're not kind of sure where things are going to go, and you bring in a McDonough, you bring in a Gensel, and it's like, man, look at the metrics.
Yeah.
And as Jack Michael said, maybe the biggest X factor of all is your Hall of Fame goaltender's playing like a Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. It's phenomenal in a lot of ways. And we don't even get to the trade deadline, which Thomas from Lutz says, coming into the trade deadline, can you prioritize what you think the Bolts' needs are? I mean, if you've been listening to the show for a while,
we've been pretty consistent. You and I maybe differ a little bit on would the Lightning move a piece off of their current team defenseman, basically, to acquire forward depth, which is what. So you and I are in agreement that the Lightning could use forward depth and or a player to play with Cirelli and Hagel, which is kind of stating it plainly, maybe more plainly than I should, because they have options for guys to play with Cirelli and Hagel. But if you're going to keep Gensel, Point, and Kucherov as a line, and you want Cirelli and Hagel to be together as line mates, who's the third guy going to be? And that has probably been the position that has rotated the most, understanding that John Cooper is a coach who mixes up the lines. So either you find someone to be that player and maybe slot everyone underneath them, and or add depth. And maybe by adding someone, if you can, to play with Hagel and Cirelli, you are improving your depth. Right. I mean, just by nature of adding a top six, you are improving your depth. But when we say adding depth forwards, it's really those bottom six type guys that cost a little bit less. And what you have said is you are open to them moving maybe one of these defensemen to get a player like that, and I'm less enthused about that.
And I'm trying to put myself in a realistic scenario where you've got to make a trade like that. And then if you have to get something that you really want, you may have to part ways with something that's not just a prospect. And so I'm trying to bring it to as real life as possible, knowing that we don't know what we don't know, and that Julian may just have to part ways with draft picks and maybe a prospect.
Yeah.
My sense is the players you're trying to acquire, maybe it's going to have to come at a price with not only a player off of your NHL roster, but maybe also some draft capital too. But that's all speculation, Thomas. But to prioritize, I think Dave and I are in agreement. We'd like to see an upgrade somewhere offensively. Look, Johansson, we got some news today with the lineup, correct? That Johansson's backing up Vasi.
Yes,
so,
he is. And
let me just talk about that.
Let me just let Jared know, who's sitting right here. Jon Abbott's ready, so he's
come on, Jared.
He is our official escort from the Calgary locker room to the Lightning Radio studios. But yes, Johansson is scheduled to back up. It looks like it's the same lineup though for the Lightning, because Cam Atkinson was out late.
Right. And you know what's interesting is we can talk about this when it does happen, if it does happen, that if they are able to acquire a little bit more depth, do they stay away from the 11 and 7 lineup? You know, which is something that I think they've gone to because it's worked. But have they gone to it to cover up maybe potential shortcomings at the forward position collectively? Mm-hmm. And so that's one way you can do it. And it speaks to what you've liked with that back end. It's been really, really good. And so it's a way to keep everybody there.
We're speculating, Thomas. It's possible
100%.
Julian Breezeball might be like, there's a defenseman out there. I love this guy. we're going to try and make a deal for this defenseman. But you asked our opinion. Our opinion is they're going to target the forward position.
That's what we think. But
Yeah.
again, Julian, last I checked, he knows this show exists, but I don't think he listens to this show.
I did have a conversation with him earlier this year. It was on the road, and I was just sitting watching the skate, and he came and sat down basically next to me. Right. So we had a very off-the-cuff conversation. I was like, we have this show. He's like, oh, really? So, I mean, he's busy between 12 and 1. Listen. And you know what? I think a lot of people who work in hockey, in the front office especially, are not spending time listening to hockey shows, hockey podcasts. I mean, it's probably best for them to have kind of the blinders on.
But this is an informative show, as John Petrugas.
This is a very, clearly other announcers like listening to Power Lunch.
That's
They're
right.
getting all the nuggets that they need to have to broadcast a Lightning game.
We should try to, in all seriousness, maybe after the season, because he's busy, to have Julian come on the show.
Yeah.
I actually think he would, because you're in studio, he would probably just make his way down.
Yeah, sure he would.
And maybe he'll spend 35 minutes with us talking hockey, and we'll take some questions, and we'll have, our audience.
By the way, there was an article, I saw Basil reference this and said, you guys should talk about this. There was an article in The Athletic that was a poll of agents. Remember we had this poll of players.
Is it anonymous?
Poll of agents. Well, the agents weren't identified. I think there were 19 agents that they asked these questions of. And it was kind of like best team to work with, best GM to work with, what have you heard from your players, best owner. Well, Jeff Vinik got the most votes as best owner, and Julien Brisebois, I think, was tied for the best general manager to deal with. And remember, you're kind of in an adversarial position when you've got an agent and a GM. Jon Abbott's here, so I'm going to
best to deal with. That's
shift my it was a very positive poll.
Yeah.
For the Lightning. John is going to make his way in here, and we're going to share our camera right there, John, as he gets settled in. And,
John's getting settled in the confines of our beautiful studio.
He's a TV guy, so he's used to dealing with cameras. And no, I always look at the laptop. John.
I can't hear you guys now.
Studios. So diehard followers of NHL broadcasters are totally up to snuff on the fact that this is your first year broadcasting for the Calgary Flames on TV. We were talking about this yesterday, though, as it relates to how few jobs there are in the NHL in Canada, because Jack Michaels is a rare U.S.-born announcer, actually, who has one of these jobs in Canada. So clarify for me and clarify for the fans, you are doing the Calgary Flames games. I understand when it's hockey night in Canada, you're not doing that game. But do you have all of the other games? And is it that way for all 7 of the teams? Or in the East, is there more of a rotation even when it's not hockey night?
Well, and you know what? I've been blessed and fortunate with some hockey night in Canada games too. So those are always, as you can imagine,
they just pull from the same stable.
It's an extra treat, my goodness, to be afforded the opportunity to be on hockey night in Canada. So that is the top of the mountain for me, and thoroughly enjoyed being able to be part of some of those broadcasts. I think it's different in every Canadian city depending on what rights holder is included. For example, I think in Toronto there's a split between Sportsnet and TSN. Sportsnet gets a few more of those games through the regular season, and then there's places like Winnipeg where it's almost exclusively TSN, and Sportsnet, in Calgary certainly has the bulk of the games. So we do pretty much every game, save for some of those Amazon Monday nights. So
yes,
we've enjoyed the journey with the Flames this season, and I've been thankful to be part of it.
John, I wanted to ask you before we get into the Flames, because you're in the business. We've been talking about it a lot, about the Four Nations bump that it may give the NHL and different viewership. What did you make of that tournament in general? High level, obviously, but do you think it's going to have the traction to attract more fans, maybe the casual fans, especially come playoff time? Or do you feel like it was an event? We've kind of see it with the Winter Classics, and maybe it doesn't do much after that.
I think the league learned how successful best on best hockey is on a international stage, and I'm thankful for that, because we'd all love to see it again, I believe, based on what we were treated to, and obviously fans in Tampa with so many different players being involved can relate to that, I'm sure, as well. And when you have the Kachuk brothers appearing on the Kelsey podcast with Travis and Jason, and when you have JJ Watt saying, hey, who's just a great hockey fan, saying, hey, there's people that haven't watched the game that are asking me what time they're going to get to my place to saddle up and take in the final against Canada and USA. So when you hear those types of things, feedback-wise, I think you get the sense of how impactful it was, and I do believe it all adds up to helping people enjoy our great sport and recognize how fantastic the National Hockey League is, the best league in the world for that particular sport as well. So it's maybe turned people's vision to, okay, we loved the players we saw in the tournament. There is the added country versus country rivalry, but we can watch them any night in Calgary and in Tampa, go at it through 82 games.
So, John, we were trying to make heads and tails of this Calgary team. And it's a team that's missed the playoffs the last 2 years, so in a better position, certainly, as we hit the home stretch here, right there in the running for wild card 2 or maybe even wild card 1. When I looked at the Flames' main stats, for the most part, I'm seeing a middle-of-the-pack team. Like, it's hard to find an area where the Flames are absolutely excelling, and maybe other than penalty killing, which is kind of low, but they've avoided kind of being near the bottom in a lot of those areas too. So the word I would use is vanilla. Like, it just seems like they're solid, but it's hard to find areas of exceptionalism. First of all, is that fair? And if it is fair, like, what is the path for the Flames to get into the playoffs this year and maybe make a run in the playoffs?
So I get where you're coming from. I would say if you watch this team every game, as we were just talking about it, as certainly we do, it's anything but vanilla, because they have to work for everything they have. So that produces a brand of hockey for the most part this season, and certainly in the games like the one they just played in Washington, where they went into the Capitals rink, where they had a 16-game home point streak, hadn't lost a regulation, or hadn't lost in regulation at home since November, and beat them straight up to start this 6-game road trip. That's the type of efforts you get from the Calgary Flames when they're at the top of their game. And that's, to the points that you brought up, Dave, it's a group that needs to be cohesive. They need everybody on the same page, and they're there to outwork the competition and play almost a tough type of playoff style hockey, because goals have been at a premium as well. So they've won a lot of games this year by 1 or 2, and they've kept a lot of games under 4. Now, I know the last time the Lightning and the Flames were involved, it wasn't that way, but that would be one of the few where it really went off the tracks for Calgary. So could they use more goal scoring? Absolutely. Would they love to maybe not depend on their goaltending as often as they've had to at times this year? Certainly. But it's just the mix that they're in right now. And, again, to your point, you look at Jonathan Huberdeau and Nazem Kadri leading the way point-wise, and, they would be probably not at the top of other teams' point-leading lists, but it exemplifies, what the Calgary Flames are doing as a group. And that is really, if they get into the playoffs, that's how they're going to get in, is sticking to their style of play and winning as a group in those really tough type of low-scoring hockey games. And
those grinded-out sorts of games do translate well in the playoffs. Is that kind of what
typically
you're thinking?
Typically they do, and I expect, some of us were joking, Kings and Canucks playing. Oh, well, that sounds like the proverbial 3-point game, and it turns out, of course it is, right? The Kings get 1 and the Canucks get 2, but I think it could be a situation where Calgary and Vancouver go back and forth right to the end. And then isn't it interesting that from a from a real world perspective, it was tough for us to go into LA and see the devastation. When the fire started, that was supposed to be a game that was played against.
We just left there,
Calgary.
actually. Yeah, we were the game before that.
Right, so we both experienced this, but isn't it interesting that now that's the one that's tacked on at the end of the Flames schedule as almost the game 83, and that could have huge implications possibly for both teams as to what happens for a playoff spot.
You mentioned the style of play conducive to playoff hockey, John, and I'm wondering, because Mish and I talk about this a lot, I think one of the things that separates the teams who really contend for the Cup compared to teams that just get in, you play that grinding style, you have goaltending, but you have some players who can take over a game and maybe win you a game or win you a series. It could be a Kucherov who has 12 points in 4 games or something like that. That's crazy. Does Calgary have that? Can they lean on a Huberdeau if they had to for a series? Is he who he is at this point? Maybe not who they thought he was going to be when they acquired him, but still a good player. Maybe not the great player. Do you feel like they have enough juice there to take over a series?
Well, I can start on Huberdeau, who you guys would have seen a lot, obviously, when he was in the state and playing with the Panthers. He is a different player, but I would say the narrative and his journey has changed from the time he began his career with the Calgary Flames to where he is now. And that's why you're seeing success with Nazem Kadri and being a relied upon guy. So he is part of the straw that stirs the drink. I think I'd lean to his line mate maybe as the first guy to reference, Greg, and Nazem Kadri. To me, there's a guy that does take over hockey games, that brings the rest of the team with him. Scored a lot of goals in the third periods this year for the Calgary Flames when they needed it the most. Those important type of clutch goals. And so when you bring up that question, my mind goes straight to number 91. But it's been a fit with Huberdeau because of how Huberdeau has worked to change his approach through the offseason and also his in-game style. He would admit that he wasn't necessarily the guy that you would think of for a 200-foot player in Florida, and he didn't have to be, especially when you're putting up 115 points in a season. But he's become that guy in Calgary, and again, going all the way back to how the Flames play, he's needed to be able to fit with how the team is playing. And so it's a refound commitment for Huberdeau, and as far as what they've seen from him in Calgary, this has been his best season since joining the Flames.
We've been trying to get a sense of the trade deadline, buyers and sellers. And in the East, there are a lot of teams that can make the case that they're going to be in the race and they may be averse to selling. In the West, there are a few teams clearly that are out of it at this point. How aggressive do you think the Flames will be to try and add at the deadline?
There's so many things I respect about Craig Conroy, and you look at some of the other trades that he's worked on in the past, and you think of a couple years ago when he had to deal with a lot of players that were going to be moved on and out of the organization. That's not easy, and some of those were, in the case like a Jacob Markstrom, perhaps, at least as we understand it, there was the desire to be moved out of Calgary. And, I don't think necessarily there were that many options available. You go and get a guy like Kevin Ball, who's now a top pair guy, and with the opportunity, depending on what Calgary does, to sign him long term, and you get some stability there. You get a Sharon Govich for a guy like Toffoli. Sharon Govich scores 31. And so I've been impressed with his patience and how he kind of stick-handled through a difficult time with some of the bigger names. You look at the Flames blue line over the last 3 years, and you see how much turnover there's been, and that's not an easy position to have that many players come in and still try to get back into the playoffs. And I know you guys deal with it in Tampa. We're just talking about Blake Coleman's 600th game tonight, and you remember the players that were big pieces of your Stanley Cups here and how those guys ended up moving on to different teams and different contracts for different reasons. But I would say, along with what Craig Conroy's done, I like the fact that he's always listening, but I don't believe anyway he's prepared to really stray too far from a longer-term approach. So you look at the trade he made with Philadelphia to get Morgan Frost and Joel Farabee.
That was an early trade, but he was on top of making the move ahead of the deadline.
And guys, that's where those players fit the age group the team's looking to move forward with. They fit the skill level, and they fit a need in the forward position, especially with Frost down the middle. So it's not a sensational, splashy ideology, I don't think, at the deadline. Anything's possible. But I believe there's a plan longer than this season, longer-term vision in place, and I think Conroy's likely to stick to that.
Last question for me too, John. I think the cap also going up is going to help teams like Calgary if they need to plug and play to complement some of those players you just alluded to. You didn't have that the last couple of years, so you really had to rely on either players rebounding from a poor year or having some younger players come up and do the job. That cap is going to give some teams a little more breathing room to potentially, address some holes.
Yeah, and I don't think it's, to be clear, I think if there was a really good opportunity to add some goal scoring and it made sense, I'm sure Craig Conroy and the Flames and Don Maloney are going to have their name in the hat, but I think it does have to make sense. And it's interesting you bring up the cap space because depending on what the Flames do or don't do, they might be a team that's a facilitator as well. They have a lot of room right now. So depending on how aggressive they are at this year's trade deadline, they may also find themselves being able to help out some teams. And whether that's picks or, live bodies coming back the other way, I'd say, that could be an element where you see Calgary working as well. So it could be a busy deadline for Calgary, even if it's not necessarily a huge splash in the market.
Yeah.
But they're in a good position. Really, what it boils down to is they're in a great position to decide what they want to do moving forward.
John, we appreciate you. Thanks for
Thank
hopping
you,
on.
John.
And
this is great, guys.
We'll see you tonight. Yeah, we got it. We got a studio. Mish is, there and break it all down.
This is where we did all the 2021 road games.
Yeah.
Although we were pointing in the other direction.
Oh, we don't want
to
have
remember those days.
I know we don't want to have those days again.
Yeah.
I'm glad you were able to do them from somewhere, but yeah, I'll knock
Stay
on
away from
everything
that.
we got here
Yes.
to make sure that those don't happen.
Well,
That's
anyway,
right.
I know I congratulated you when we saw you in Calgary, but congratulations again on
Appreciate it.
on the opportunity with the Flames and keep up the great work.
Thanks
Good luck
for-
to the
thanks,
Flames
John.
down the stretch.
Thanks very much, fellas. Appreciate
Yeah,
it. You guys
got
as well.
it, sir. We'll talk to you tonight down at the arena. So breaking it all down, I thought a very good pulse of what was happening with Calgary, Mish.
I will
and
never again call the Calgary Flames vanilla. So
Why would you?
they did not have their best game against the Lightning back in Calgary, but look, what he said made sense. Like if you are going to work and work and work and work, even if your overall stats
Yeah.
aren't really remarkable, and that's the word I'm going to use. They're not remarkable. It doesn't mean that they're remarkably bad, just they're not remarkably outstanding either.
Correct.
You're going to put yourself in position to win a lot of games, and that's what he said. Like they have a good record. They have a better record than a fair number of teams in the West.
They do.
So they're in 9th place out of 16 teams. They're well over Hockey 500. And what he said is, they won a lot of close games. And they've kept games close, which is key. Like we talk about that. Avoiding those regulation losses is so important.
I think that's a recipe to get in to the playoffs.
Right.
I just don't know if it's a recipe to make a run in the playoffs.
Right.
And that's what I was trying to get at with do you have enough game breakers? You need them. It's what the Lightning have had. They've checked all the boxes when they've won the cup. The Flames, I think if you're checking those boxes, you're like, okay, can do some things in close games, win some games that are tightly contested. I mean, maybe it's the goaltending. You want to check that box. I mean, that remains to be seen.
Well, when you talk about game breakers, or when you talk about game breakers, like the goalie can be in some ways a game breaker.
Yeah,
like
that's
if it's
fair.
Dustin
That's
Wolf,
fair.
and Dustin Wolf is going to play out of his mind and hold the opposition to 1 goal or 2 goals per game, then missing some pop offensively is not going to hurt as much because you may only need 1 or 2 yourself, right?
Right.
But that's hard to do over a 7-game series, and it's certainly hard to do over 4 rounds, to get where you want to get.
Makes sense.
But look, they're an improving team, and look, he's right. They did make the trade with Philadelphia, so Morgan Frost and Joel Farabee are now members of the Calgary Flames. I mean, look, Andrei Kuzmenko, was he the main piece in the Lindholm deal? I mean, Lindholm's not in Vancouver anymore either. Like, he's gone from Vancouver, but
Yeah.
trading Elias Lindholm, like he was the center on that dominant line.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy you got back, I would say the centerpiece of that trade that you're getting back didn't even last a year with you.
Right.
And you moved him to Philadelphia. Now, look, if Morgan Frost turns into kind of what the Flyers had hoped they would be getting from him when they drafted him in the first round, all right. You talked about, depth down the middle. Kuzmenko's not a center. So they traded Jacob Peltier. I think he was a first-round pick as well for the Flames. But we'll see if this is one of those trades that both teams end up being happy with how it turned out.
It's a good observation. Anthony says, amazing to see this team playing like a unit. I can't decide who I would move from the bottom 6 after the last 6 games. Atkinson is the 13th forward, but who else? Hard decision for JBB. Leafs playing pretty awful and still getting a W. Goalies saving them this year.
Well, technically Atkinson is the 12th forward because he's being scratched, and the Lightning are going with 11-7 because Connor Geekie is in the minors right now. Did you see the Lightning traded Ullinen?
I did.
For Anthony Angelo.
Former Penguin prospect.
Former Penguins prospect.
Big guy, 6'6".
Mm-hmm.
Didn't play physical. That was part of it as why it didn't work out, but a very big body.
Yeah.
So your screen froze.
Yeah, I'm looking at Steve's screen. I'm fine. I hear you fine. Can you hear me okay?
No,
yeah,
I
look like like a jigsaw puzzle. I look like an impressionist painting.
There's blue.
Right now.
There's blue to like it's like a wave. Like you're
It's one of those sand designs, and somebody took it and shook it, and I'm all over the map.
That's pretty cool.
But I don't think that's my. If you're seeing it, then
you
that's
might be able to
just my
turn
computer.
your camera off if you wanted to. See,
yeah, maybe I should do that so people aren't.
And then you're going to delete yourself, and then I'll be talking to myself when that happens,
right.
knowing. But I think we've talked about this before. Atkinson, to me, it's pretty clear he is the forward who is going to be the one that's in and out of the lineup, at least at this point. I think the AC Monts, the Gergensons, and the Gonsalveses, to a lesser extent, have done enough recently to play on a regular basis.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think that's where it is right now. Is Atkinson a nice ace in the hole, if you want to call it that, if you needed to have him come in and play a few games because of an injury? Yeah, for sure. And I think he's played better over the last couple of months.
Mm-hmm.
Doing some things offensively, which is more his game, but going to those tough areas of the ice and making a play.
He had 2 nice assists in the 2 games prior to being scratched against Edmonton.
Yep.
But as the fan mentioned, I forget which fan had it as the 13th forward, but I mean, as the 12th forward, when you're dressing 11-7, he's going to have to sit out. He's a very good attitude. I mean, he's kind of a very optimistic, upbeat guy, which is another reason why I think the Lightning wanted to add him. And it's not like he's grumbling about being out of the lineup, which is what his year has looked like. He's been out of the lineup this year.
Yeah.
But when he's come in, he's played hard. He's tried to contribute, and at points he has contributed.
Yeah. I mean, he's played better. That's all I'm going to say. But it's also the reason why we're having the conversation about maybe upgrading the depth. I think it goes back to, in this specific instance, Atkinson and Sherry kind of similar to a degree that you wanted these guys to pan out and be more of a fixture. I think that might be the best way to describe it, at least on my end. Basil says, I like the 11-7 lineup, especially in the playoffs. If a D-man's injured, they still have 6, plus 11 forwards creates natural opportunities to be creative with lines. I wonder how the Bolts' record when 11-7 compares with a record when 12-6 in the regular season in the post.
Well, he being John Cooper has gone 11-7 a lot over the course of his coaching career, and it hasn't been like there have been some years where he's hardly done it at all. There have been years where he's done it more regularly. So when I say a lot, it's relative to other teams, but the sample size is big enough that, I mean, the Lightning's record is probably comparable, honestly, because they've been a consistent team in terms of their winning percentage and point percentage. So it's probably very similar.
Yeah.
The one time I remember them using 11-7 for an extended period of time in the playoffs was 2020 when they were playing in the bubble. And that came about because Ryan McDonagh got hurt in game 1 of the second-round series against Boston. And instead of just replacing McDonagh with one guy, they replaced McDonagh with 2 guys. Luke Shen and Braden Coburn both came in for the time that McDonagh was out. And then when McDonagh returned, Shen stayed in the lineup. And the Lightning basically went 11-7 through the middle 2 rounds of that playoff run. And I think because they lost, maybe not because they lost, but they lost game 1 of the final against Dallas, going 11-7. I think they went back to 12-6 for game 2, and they ended up, winning that series. So that was a pretty even 50-50 split. I don't remember the Lightning doing the 11-7 in other playoff runs, but I may just not be remembering. You said, what is John Cooper's preference? Well, I guess if we really ask that question, when the stakes are at their highest, he's gone 12-6, except the one time that he had his hand forced because you're pulling McDonagh out of the lineup in the bubble, and he went 11-7, and then they were winning. So he kept it the same. I mean, they didn't win every game. They lost some games to the Islanders in the third round, but not enough that he was going to change back to 12-6. But most of the time in the playoffs, he's gone 12-6.
Well, we've got a game tonight, and then be on the road for a little bit.
Yeah.
Right? A little bit. So
yeah. 12:30 on Saturday, Lightning and Capitals. Caps do play tonight. They host St. Louis as Ovi's looking to get closer to the record.
Yep.
And then a big game, Lightning and Panthers Monday. This is after tonight. Lightning and Flames tonight. After that, Lightning Caps Saturday afternoon, Lightning Panthers Monday night and sunrise, and then a back-to-back home against Columbus on Tuesday. I think Columbus.
Some good teams. Columbus is playing well.
I'd be surprised if Columbus is playing on Monday. Columbus might be here being in Tampa, waiting for the Lightning. Steve's checking the schedule right now. So that'll be an advantage for the Blue Jackets. At least it's not a long trip.
Right.
It's not a heavy lift for the Lightning, and that'll start a 3-game homestand. This is a favorable part of the Lightning schedule with a lot of home games. That script is going to flip a little bit in the middle of March. So
it's a good stretch coming up of teams.
Is that Columbus's? Yeah. So Columbus is off. Yeah, they actually play. They play their outdoor game. They have that outdoor game where Ohio State plays against Detroit on Saturday, and they don't play again until they see the Lightning on Tuesday.
Gotcha.
Here.
That makes sense.
Yeah. That's a pretty big set. I think Columbus and Detroit right now, I mean, the standings can change quickly. I believe they occupy the 2 wildcard spots in the East. Steve's giving me the thumbs up, and they play a home and home. So they play in Detroit tonight, and then they have the outdoor game Saturday. I believe they play tonight in Detroit. Yes, they do. So we talk about 4-point games. You have the 2 wildcard teams squaring off.
It's going to be busy. It's going to be fun. We're gonna be
You'd like to see the Lightning, and I'll use this phrase, take care of business. Yeah. They came out of the break. They wanted to keep the win streak going. They've successfully done that. This has been a good homestand, no matter what happens tonight. They've already won the first 2. But you'd like to see them keep building. If they can get the win tonight, they will be at 72 points with 2 games left in this 10-game segment. That would be huge.
Rolling.
And these 2 road games are going to be tough. They are, based on the quality of the opposition.
We'll have the call tonight at 7, you and the Hall of Famer.
Yep.
And I will talk to you guys close to the puck.
We are pre-taping for tomorrow. I actually have a commitment in the morning, and then the team is flying out this afternoon. So we're doing a late night. We're doing like power midnight snack tonight.
So get your questions.
So we have our Friday show. Yeah, we have our Friday show, but you and I are doing it after the game tonight.
That'll be fun.
Yeah.
Stay up. Have some coffee.
Yeah. We'll have some more coffee. There we go.
All right, partner. Great job as always. Thanks to Jon Abbott as well Great stuff from him.
Yep.
Steve Ersnick, Jared Johnson, and for everybody listening, I'm Greg Linnelli. You've been listening to Power Lunch on Lightning Radio.